will be leading this discussion today, but before we get started, I'm going to turn this over to Zoe from ASMI and ASEMSO to just talk about how we're going to conduct the webinar. Zoe?
Hi, thanks, Sue. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Zoe, your intro project coordinator for ASEMSO. Just so everybody knows, we're going to keep you all muted throughout Rick's presentation. And if you have a question, please write it down, and then we'll have a period at the end of the presentation where you can use the GoToWebinar function to raise your hand, and then we will go through and unmute everyone. So please feel free to send me a chat message or send a chat message to Sue if you have any technical difficulties throughout the webinar. Okay, thank you, Sue.
And without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Rick Masters.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here and pleased to give some direction and hopefully some guidance on what to expect as we stand up this new commission. As Sue indicated, as the special counsel for the National Center for Interstate Compacts, this is certainly not the first time that I've been called on to assist a newly formed compact commission with its organizational steps, and I have been through this at least a half a dozen times that I can think of, and then in various other roles with respect to the ongoing maintenance and implementation of these compacts. So we would like to make this as expeditious and efficient as possible, but we certainly want to leave time for questions. And while I think it would be better if we could proceed through the slides and ask you to hold your questions to the end, if somebody has a burning issue that you just feel can't wait, if you'll raise your hand, we can unmute you and deal with it earlier than after we finish going through this initial bank of slides. So with that said, I'm going to proceed here with Sue's help to the substantive overview of the REPLICA Commission and commissioners and various roles and responsibilities that you will be finding yourselves responsible for in this new role. As all of you are aware, this organization has been formed by operation of state law. The statutes that have been enacted in 12 states have created this entity called a commission. It is not dissimilar to the governing boards of other types of organizations, and many of you, or at least some of you, have probably been board members of various not-for-profit or perhaps even for-profit organizations during which you have had experience deliberating on the matters that have to do with that particular nonprofit organization or that particular business. Many of these roles and responsibilities are very similar, but I think it's important as we begin this to remind everyone that what we are in charge of running here as commissioners will be a governmental entity that has been created by state law. It is not a for-profit corporation. It is not a non-profit corporation. It is a governmental entity which didn't come into existence by virtue of being incorporated, but by virtue of the statutes having created this entity. And because of that, the same types of responsibilities that you would expect for yourself and members of your staff in your emergency medical office and your emergency management offices will be applicable to the role that you have with this commission. Think of this as an extension of your existing responsibilities for your state in order to manage the multi-state licensure aspects of this newly minted compact. And I think if you view it as an extension of what you're already doing, it may make even more sense. So today we're going to go through a number of slides identifying these responsibilities and talk briefly about how to view your role and perhaps prepare for what you're about to do. At the first meeting, we will be presenting a draft of some bylaws. As many of you know from prior experience with other organizations, bylaws set forth the procedures by which this organization will run itself. So that will include provisions concerning meetings, how they're called, what constitutes a quorum, what officers are elected and what they are responsible for doing in each office, committees that may be formed by the commission and what their responsibilities will do. The other responsibilities that you have in addition to preparing for the running of this organization through adopting bylaws will be to establish rules, which is even more important. This organization, as a governmental entity, an interstate agency of the member states, has the authority, which has been given to it by your legislature, to promulgate rules to run the compact. And those rules will be very narrow in scope, and they will be for the purpose of making sure that the interstate aspects of licensure are properly managed. So that means that the requirements that are set forth in the compact are being met, an appropriate process is in place to vet the applicants for licensure so that it can be verified that they in fact measure up to the standards that are required under each state's compact and under the provisions of the compact, and to make sure that we are enforcing the obligations that each state has to make sure licensees are properly vetted and that issues pertaining to multi-state licensure are being administered properly through this commission. And so when you see on this slide things like monitoring compliance and initiate interventions to correct noncompliance, what we're talking about here is the compact itself is a set of obligations that are now part of your state's statutes and obligate every state to perform the business of administering multi-state licensures for EMTs across state lines. And each state is to comply with those duties, and one of your roles as a commissioner will be to make sure that that compliance is being observed, and that where there are issues that come up due to lack of understanding, lack of training, or perhaps even disagreement as to what the obligation should be, the institution known as the commission will have the authority to enforce this compact. Certainly training is going to be one of the ongoing responsibilities that you'll be overseeing. My guess is you're probably going to create a training committee that will be primarily responsible for following up on training issues on a regular basis, but as a commissioner, you'll be overseeing that responsibility as well as the duties of the other committees that you may decide to form. The database that consists of the information necessary to both vet licensees to make sure they are qualified and eligible for licensure will also be used for things like discipline and will be a very important aspect of your responsibility to make sure it is being properly maintained, properly supervised, that privacy concerns are being appropriately observed, and all things that go with the technology that I know all of you have to deal with on an individual basis in your states are also being taken care of through the compact. And then naturally you're going to run yourselves by electing officers and appointing people to various committees to make sure the work of this commission gets done. And I think we can go to the next slide, Sue. Another aspect of the commission role that each of you has is to act as a liaison between this governing body and your state. That means people within your EMS offices as well as key stakeholders, which may be people that work for your governor, legislators, and others in your state that you consider stakeholders with regard to emergency management. You will also make sure your state is properly complying with whatever financial obligations will flow from your membership in the compact, whether that's through processing fees that are levied on each licensee or however we ultimately decide to fund the organization. You'll be responsible for making sure that's appropriately taken care of in your state. Certainly, it is anticipated that if you are appointed as a commissioner to this governing board, it's important that you attend. And so meetings, for the most part, I think will be electronic, but we will have some face-to-face meetings on occasion, and it's certainly important that you make this a priority. If your state has given you the privilege and the honor of serving as a commissioner, we're sure that you will want to acquit yourselves well. And you also are going to be responsible for making sure that your state is appropriately implementing the compact pursuant to the provisions of the statute and any rules that are agreed upon by the Commission. You may, from time to time, have issues related to implementation of the rules. Certainly in the early stages of development, I'm sure there will be lots of questions and lots of issues that arise from the data system and the licensure process and the rules, as well as compact provisions that center on properly vetting applicants and making sure that data is being transmitted to verify eligibility, so that when these practitioners become licensed, they are ready to go and able to practice across state lines. Where there are implementation issues, there will be a staff in place that will process these requests, but ultimately you will be governing yourselves. You will have the executive committee of the organization, which will be a subset of the commission, which will, for lack of a better term, engage in attending to day-to-day operations that need oversight, but the commission ultimately, as a group, will be responsible for holding the commission accountable, including all of its committees, for making sure that decisions are being properly made. Where there are requests or problems that pop up in your state, the initial consultation is going to be directed to you. It's our belief that you should be in the loop, regardless of whether you may need to enlist the support and the help of staff or consultants on behalf of the commission. You need to be the first person that someone contacts if there's a problem or an issue that affects your state that either another state wants to bring up or someone else in the process needs to discuss that's going on in your state. And we want to keep all of you in the loop in that regard so that you can be aware of those requests and be available to respond to them. There will be dispute resolution processes that are authorized under the compact. It is presumed that where there are lapses or non-compliance issues that arise, certainly in the initial stages, much of that is going to be the result of lack of training or lack of understanding, not some sort of willful desire not to comply with the compact. And so in most cases, I believe it will be safe to say that we can assume that most initial issues of compliance will arise from a lack of training. And so we're going to do everything possible to make sure that those issues are ready to be dealt with a training process that's been developed under the auspices of the Commission and a training committee, so that those problems, when they arise, can be quickly handled. There may be times, however, where there are differences of opinion about what the compact requires or what a rule means in a particular case. And so there are going to be more formal dispute resolution processes set up under the compact, which allows for and authorizes both mediation and arbitration. Mediation, of course, is an informal way of resolving a dispute where two or more states may have a difference of opinion about how something is being handled, and a mediation is scheduled to try to work that out through some sort of negotiated process. However, if it becomes the case that there is a lack of compliance and a question that starts out as a dispute turns into a compliance issue where a particular state simply isn't complying with the obligations under the compact, there are also more formal ways of handling the resolution of those problems, and we'll discuss that in a later slide. It's important that you exercise your role, which many of you coming from your EMS offices already are engaged in, of maintaining your relationships with other commissioners from other states, with federal partners that are involved in emergency management and related activities, and to keep in touch with commission staff and those who will be managing the database, which again will be a significant aspect of this process. It will be the Commission's responsibility to make sure that the Commission is being properly administered, that funding is being processed in an appropriate way, that adequate resources are available for the staff that the Commission needs, for services that the Commission needs, including technology capabilities, and resources for the training of commissioners and those in your offices who will be managing this interstate compact process of multi-state licensure. Now, the committees that are going to be suggested are, again, pretty typical of most other types of organizations. Certainly, it shouldn't be necessary to convene the entire membership of the Commission, which, when it consists of 12 people, may not seem like quite as much of a hassle, but as this compact grows to 25, 35, 50 members, trying to get all of those people together to make a decision shouldn't be necessary except for the annual meetings and on the occasional issue that may have to be voted on by everybody. And so an executive committee is indispensable to being able to run an organization like this, and the bylaws will provide for a subgroup of the Commission labeled as an executive committee, which will have the authority to make decisions on behalf of the Commission and will include your officers, which will probably be a chairperson, a vice chair, a secretary, a treasurer, and a member or members at large, which you all will elect from among your ranks as members of the Commission. That executive committee will have the authority to do whatever the Commission can do on an interim basis between Commission meetings, with the exception of amending the compact or amending the rules. But this committee will serve as an oversight group for the operations of the compact for all other purposes, so it's not necessary to convene the entire group of commissioners every time you turn around. And areas of responsibility, for example, of the executive committee are on this slide. Naturally, making sure the budget is on track, that the governing infrastructure is in place, that the committees have been appointed, that absence of a commissioner in a certain state is dealt with by addressing that state's governmental system of appointments to make sure that the new commissioner is appointed when somebody resigns or retires or, God forbid, passes away. That will be an important function to make sure everybody is on track with a new appointment if that's necessary. Obviously, long-range planning should be part of the process of any organization, including a governmental organization like this, and I suspect that the Commission will have some opportunities to engage in long-range planning of a deliberate nature that will, I'm sure, be discussed as one of your action items at the first Commission meeting. Obviously, the officers, again, if you've served in other organizations, whether not-for-profit or for-profit, this shouldn't come as any surprise. There'll be a chairperson that will have the authority to call and preside at all of the Commission and Executive Committee meetings. There'll be a vice chair that is just a heartbeat away from the chair's office, as they say, and will perform the duties of the chair in the absence of the chairperson on some temporary basis for a meeting with which there's an unavoidable conflict, or to act on behalf of the chair when that is necessary. There will be a secretary that will work with the national staff to keep minutes of the Commission meetings, to act as the document custodian, and to manage documents according to various retention policies based upon both the Commission rules and policies as well as other state and federal laws that require certain documents to be maintained. The Treasurer will act as the custodian of the funds and monitor the administration of the fiscal aspects of the compact, and certainly it will be expected that much of that process will also be aided through the activities of your national office staff, which will work directly with the Treasurer to make sure that the accounting aspects of this and the expenditures on behalf of the Commission are being properly tracked and reported. Other committees, which again, you may decide to have committees that do these things, but maybe refer to them by other names, or you might have some subdivisions of this group, but generally speaking, most compact organizations and other organizations have found that these types of committees make sense because of the functions and the variety of issues that arise in running an organization like this. So in addition to the executive committee, it's expected that there will be a training, education, and public relations committee, which it does just what it sounds like it does. It makes sure that there's appropriate material and opportunities for training, both in terms of commissioners as well as staff, that there are appropriate protocols in place to make sure that when a new commissioner is appointed, there's an orientation ready to go for that person. Once you get people up to speed, the problem is in all areas of life, there's a lot of turnover, particularly in governmental bodies such as this, and so you're always going to be having a new crop of commissioners that are coming on board or new staff members that have to be trained, and there ought to be regular and recurring opportunities for such training, both online and live on occasion. Public relations is also important for developments that arise. There'll be a lot of media inquiries on issues pertaining to not only emergency management, but the EMT licensure process, particularly in the early stages. We want to make sure that we're speaking with a consistent voice through appropriate press releases and protocols for who's going to talk to the media and what the messaging is going to be, both on an ad hoc basis and on a permanent basis as you develop materials that get the word out about this commission and about the activities of multi-state licensure for EMTs. A compliance committee is usually a necessary and unfortunately somewhat regularly functioning subgroup of your commission, and this, as it sounds like from the name, will be the committee that deals with issues related to whether states are complying with their obligations. One of the important aspects of using an interstate compact to manage interstate licensure for EMTs is to make sure that we have statutory requirements that are in place in the laws of each state, and that those can be enforced when somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do. Obviously, we hope that those issues come up few and far between, but certainly there will be a need to provide clarity where there is some issue regarding noncompliance. And again, we'll start with the assumption that in most cases that's simply ignorance, which can be cured through education and training, or simply lack of understanding of what the responsibilities should be, and that can be addressed again through training at the national level and on a state-by-state basis. Rules and Bylaws Committee will obviously deal with those two areas of governance. Certainly your rulemaking functions will be, at least for the first few years of the compact, a fairly regular occurrence. Now it's likely that, as has happened with other interstate compacts, once you have had several years to mature as a governing group and as a functioning commission, it's likely that you're going to reach a stage where the rules that work best and are carefully and thoughtfully put into place by the best judgment of all of you as acting as a commission will serve you well, and that you will probably get to a stage where rulemaking doesn't happen as often. In fact, there are many examples of compact commissions where for the first few years it seemed like they were making rules every year, and then it became clear that finally we reached the point where we had a satisfactory group of rules that made sense, and in some cases, compacts have opted to go for an every other year rule review process and to only deal with rulemaking on a less than annual basis. But I think in the early stages, certainly that will be important, and I certainly suggest to you that a Rules and Bylaws Committee will be a necessary subgroup to do the work on behalf of the Commission so that rules are properly vetted and considered when they're introduced to the Commission for voting at your annual meetings. Finance Committee, again, is just what it sounds like. You'll be dealing with the funds that are entrusted to this process by the member states and make sure that it's used frugally and carefully and according to the requirements of the compact and the rules. Some of the training that will occur, we've talked about, certainly the EMS offices. We know that you have a lot more to do than simply deal with the issues pertaining to multi-state licensure, but that is one of the functions that is being added by virtue of this compact. And so you'll want to make sure that whoever deals with that on a regular basis in your offices is properly trained, and the PR and Training Committee will oversee the process by which those materials are developed and circulated to all of your office staff, all of the commissioners, and the outside world. Certainly some of that will include not just the substantive information about the compact itself, but information about the legal obligations of a state under the compact, as well as the requirements that a licensee has to meet in order to participate as a person that has an interstate privilege to operate across state lines. The Compliance Committee, again, will develop the best means of approaching enforcement issues. Again, it starts with the assumption that we try to resolve this at the lowest level possible in order to achieve compliance. We don't start out threatening lawsuits. In fact, in my experience, the need to file any kind of formal legal action is very rare, but it's not unprecedented. So the good news is you've got the hammer that can be used if you have to use the hammer, but frequently disputes can be resolved simply by picking up the phone. A lot of times it simply starts with one commissioner in one state talking to another commissioner in another state about a problem that developed and can be fairly easily handled simply by telephone communication and some follow-up. Where that doesn't happen, there will be policies the Compliance Committee will be responsible for proposing, as well as potentially some rulemaking concerning the best way to engage in interventions to help achieve compliance. And again, we're going to use both carrots and sticks, and we hope to use more carrots than we use sticks, but we have the sticks if necessary. Rules Committee will be a very important group that will help meet your obligations under the compact, and the Rules Committee can be viewed as the subgroup that is entrusted with making sure that the rules that you're going to be voting on when you get to your annual commission meetings have been properly drafted, that those have already been circulated prior to the meeting for general knowledge and understanding of all the commissioners, so that you have an opportunity to be aware of what the rules are that are being proposed and an opportunity to comment on those, both pro and con. If you think it's a good idea, you'll have an opportunity to say so. If you think it's a terrible idea, you'll have an opportunity to say so well in advance of the time that these things are voted on. And the Rules Committee will oversee that process, as well as any tweaking that needs to be done to the terms of a particular rule. And frequently, the Rules Committee also acts as the arbiter of making sure the rules are consistent, because sometimes once you have a set of rules that you use to run your organization, somebody will come up with what they think is a great idea, but then you discover that if you start making a change in one particular area of the rules, you have some unintended consequences of affecting other rules that might be in conflict with it. So we want the Rules Committee to act as an arbitration body, if you will, to make sure that they have reviewed those so that you're aware before the rule gets to the voting process that, it could present some unintended consequences and to be considered within the entire body of the rules instead of in isolation. Based on the comments and commissioners' input, those rules will be prepared for your consumption and review and voting at your annual meetings. Those rules in their final form will be submitted for a formal vote to the commissioners at an annual meeting and will be subject to not only the notice requirements that will be put in place before you reach the meeting at which these rules will be debated, but there will be a public hearing where other stakeholders, other members of the public will have an opportunity to comment on these rules, and that information can be taken into account. The Commission will have the authority to make these rules by majority vote, and while some may think that perhaps a majority is a hazardous way to make rules, in my experience, it's much more difficult than you think to get a majority vote on a rule unless it's clearly the case that it's a needed reform or a needed principle or a needed point that has to be addressed within the context of the compact. And in most cases, the voting is such that with the advance notice that you're going to receive under the rulemaking procedures and the opportunity for comment, most people will know walking in whether a particular rule is a good idea or is going to be dead on arrival, so to speak. And I have found that in most cases, the rules are adopted by much more than a majority, but if push comes to shove, a simple majority will be sufficient to pass a rule. The Finance Committee, again, is chaired by the Treasurer, and as the name suggests, is responsible for your budget, your financial practices, and your reporting, including the auditing. There is an annual audit that's anticipated so that the funds are being properly tracked and accounted for, and that information is provided to each member state and your appropriate officials to make sure everyone's aware that we're acting in transparency and consistent with sound budget practices. Well, we have spent the first 30 minutes, which is about on track with what we had hoped to do, going through some of the general principles related to running the organization. I don't think there's anything that is tremendously controversial, although I understand that many of you may have some angst about this new role that you're going to find yourself in as a commissioner. So we want to try to make that process as understandable as we can and with the least anxiety possible for you to experience as you prepare for the meeting. But we also wanted to make sure you had an opportunity for questions. So at this point, I'm going to open the floor, and we'll be happy to entertain questions for the remainder of our time, unless Sue has some other points that she wants to share that perhaps I glossed over or didn't point out.
Oh, Rick, I think you did an excellent job. I do have a few questions, but I'm going to turn it over to everyone else first, and if they don't get covered by participants in the call, I'd be happy to ask them. So where I don't see any hands up right now, I know Zoe, you're monitoring that. Do you see any up?
I do not.
Okay, so Rick, some of the things you touched on in the very early parts of the discussion, you talked about, dealing with, in the new days of a commission, implementation issues. Can you think of any experiences, ones that you could share where compacts have had implementation issues? What some examples of those might be? I know it'll be different for EMS per se from a subject matter perspective, but just structurally speaking, like what were some of the barriers you came up against and how were they resolved?
Well, I think the process that's been set up here of having a commission to deliberate in and of itself is a means of brokering issues that come up. But I think the areas that are likely to prompt some discussion and perhaps some debate will be how these rules are appropriately fashioned and how the procedure of interstate licensure is governed, including the technology aspects of it. And that includes not only the vendor or the service provider, but the ways in which the Commission and the state EMS offices will interface with that technology system, and what's necessary to make sure that all of the information is flowing in the direction that it's supposed to go with the appropriate safeguards in place, and that the fees that are used to satisfy the costs of both licensure and administering this process are being appropriately charged and accounted for and used for the purpose of Commission operations as well as the licensure process within each state.
Great, thank you.
I see we have a hand raised from Dia Gaynor. Dia, I'm going to unmute you in just a second here.
Greetings.
You're unmuted.
Greetings, Rick. Thanks for the great presentation. I have two questions. How common is it for a state to exit an interstate compact by repealing the law, and under what scenarios have you seen that happen? The second question, after the Commission stands up and forms committees, what kinds of cautions or limits are there on committee proceedings in between Commission meetings to avoid any appearance of, things happening behind closed doors?
Well, the first question about repeal, most of the time the due diligence that went into the process by which the statute was adopted to begin with has a certain level of permanency to it, and in my experience it has been rare, if ever, that a state, once it has made the considered decision to enter into a compact, decides to repeal it, particularly if it is accomplishing the objectives for which it was established. Occasionally you'll have some crisis or some bad case that will come up in a state, and in some cases, fairly or unfairly, the compact may get the blame, or the media tends to focus on some aspects more than others. And I can recall one particular case involving the Interstate Compact for Adult Offender Supervision, which is responsible for making sure potentially dangerous probationers and parolees that cross state lines and have their supervision transferred from one state to another are being properly supervised. I can recall a case where a parolee who had been transferred under the compact from one state to another engaged in some fairly significantly bad behavior, including the murder of 3 police officers in a coffee shop. And naturally, that was on the front page of not just the local media, but throughout the country, precipitating a great deal of scrutiny, and blame was being spread around everywhere it could possibly be spread, and one of those areas was calling into question the state's membership in the compact. While initially there was some threat by the legislature to repeal, once cooler heads were allowed to prevail and a full investigation was conducted, it was determined that it really was more a question of how the courts were enforcing or not enforcing various laws regarding bail and being able to release an offender under certain circumstances, and it really, strictly speaking, wasn't the fault of the compact. However, as a result of the controversy and some appearances by the governor at commission meetings, by Skype, various visits from Congress people from that particular state to the commission offices, and a great deal of debate back and forth within the commission, there were some rule changes that were made to provide some additional safeguards. And so what sounded like a potentially horrible situation where we might have had a state that actually repealed the compact, it actually resulted in a strengthening of the rules and the ability to learn from the mistakes, whoever was responsible and whoever there was to blame. So that's a long way of answering your question, but I think it's safe to say it's not often that a state actually repeals, and even where there is a threat to do so, many times the reasons for it can be addressed in ways that don't require a repeal. Now, the second question, I think, Dia, was with regard to cautions or limits, but if you could restate that, I've kind of forgotten the context in which you were raising the second question.
No problem. It was a question about committee proceedings between commission meetings and limits or cautions for those committee deliberations, if not decision making, to avoid the appearance of decisions being made behind closed doors.
Okay, and I think what you're talking about to lawyers is probably open meetings requirements, and the idea that you don't want a cocktail party between 3 or 4 members of a committee to turn into a committee meeting. And I certainly think you have to be careful with that. But we have created within the compact certain rules for transparency, and the commission will be able to fashion rules in that regard. And my philosophy is we want to be sure that the process is transparent, but we don't want to make the restrictions so draconian that you can't carry on your business. So I think the answer is we want to govern in sunshine. We don't want to do it behind closed doors, but there are some provisions in the compact itself, and that can be promulgated through rules governing when it's appropriate to close a meeting and when it's not. And the cautions will be make sure that when you have business items that need to be discussed, you don't deliberately set up a situation where there's a pre-meeting meeting behind closed doors. And policing that is up to all of us. I mean, there's a certain level of self-awareness that I think is necessary. And if that does become an issue, there are certainly a means to deal with that through the compliance process and the dispute resolution process under the compact.
Thank you.
Okay, next I see a hand raised by Donna Tidwell. Donna, I'm going to unmute you in just a second here. Okay, you're unmuted.
Okay, this is Donna. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think my question was pretty much answered, Rick, but I was interested in the fact about the decisions and the activities that the executive board would do in between meetings. Would that executive committee be responsible to have minutes or to make a report to the full board on what they did in between meetings of the full board?
Yes, and the way that has functioned in the past with other compacts is that the meetings are recorded. If someone would want to have a transcript or an audio copy of the proceeding, it is available, and there are written minutes that are prepared, and in most cases, in other compacts, are posted on the website so that anyone who wishes to review what was done and what was said and what was decided has the opportunity to do so.
Thank you.
Okay, next I see Guy Dancy's hand is raised. Guy, I'm going to unmute you in a moment. Okay, you are unmuted.
Okay, thank you. My question, in your presentation, you talked a little bit about the commission and then an executive commission. How does that correlate with the 10 states that were the first ones to adopt or to enact this? Just curious on if we're, just so the terminology in my mind makes sense. Because I knew that there was some language about the first 10 states, and how does that fit into what you just presented about the executive or the commission? Thanks.
I think probably what you're referring to is the fact that the first states that have entered the compact will be the first group that will be able to consider and vet any rules that are decided. And so that doesn't mean that they can do anything that they want regardless of what the compact says, but it does mean that the first group around the table gets to decide the best way to implement this, and states that haven't enacted the compact yet will have to come into a situation where some rules have already been determined. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be changed or amended, but it does mean that the earlier you're in the compact, the earlier you have an opportunity to start immediately making rules and having input on what those should be. The issue about the executive committee really doesn't make as much difference when there's only 12 states at the table. And in some cases, other compact commissions have decided that for some period of time, there really wasn't any difference between the executive committee and the commission because there were so few states, and so they sort of acted as what parliamentarians would call a committee of the whole. But once you have 20 or 30 or 50 states at the table, all of a sudden trying to get 50 people together is much more difficult and really unnecessary to have a major debate just deciding on, what color the wallpaper should be. So the executive committee is the subgroup of the commission that will have the authority to meet on a regular basis, probably no more than once a month, to just make sure that the day-to-day business that's being experienced by compact offices throughout the country is being properly handled, and if there is an issue that's come up, that there's somebody that's not asleep at the switch and can react to it on a quick basis rather than have to wait until we can convene 20 or 30 or 40 states.
Thank you much. That answered my questions. Appreciate it.
Yes. Still have some time.
Zoe, thought I saw a question from Scott Winston.
Yeah, I'm having trouble reading it. If you can read it out loud so everybody can hear it if they can't see it.
The compact is a set of obligations that are part of a member state statutes. What impact will there be in a member state that uses terminology and definitions that do not line up with those in the compact? For example, use of certification versus licensure to recognize an individual's privilege to practice.
Sometimes it's simply a question of semantics, and while you may be asking a question that could have some legal significance, Scott, I think based on the review that I've done of the existing compact statutes, most, if not all, of those differences are what I would put into the category of semantics, where essentially they mean the same thing. We just may need to nuance that a bit as we start dealing with the actual licensure that's taking place. Now, if we do find there's some difference in understanding as to what it is, there are some workarounds that are probably possible, and certainly we've got some rulemaking that can be done to clarify how everybody can be on the same page.
Perfect, thank you. Are there any other questions for Rick? And the second question I had's already been answered. So if we don't have any other questions, Rick, if we could just wrap up. And again, this webinar has been recorded, so I'll be sending the link to our website to be making it available for folks that couldn't be here today. Rick, are there any comments you want to make in closing?
No, again, I want to encourage you to ask questions as they arise. I believe your planning group has left you in a good place, and I think that the people that you have entrusted with these responsibilities, including Sue and Dia and others, have done an outstanding job getting this thing ready for prime time. So I believe you're going to be presented with what I would call a menu of options, which you get you have the ability and the authority to choose when you get to the annual meeting out in Oklahoma, and I think it's all going to go very well, and it looks to me like things are on track.
Great, thank you very much, Rick. Zoe, anything from your end?
No, thank you, Sue.
Great. Rick, I think that was I appreciate your time today. Some of this information is new, some of it is a review, but as we're spooling up during this implementation phase, you will have these opportunities for little primers to just talk about basic responsibilities, expectations. In our next call, we're going to talk about transitional issues. It doesn't mean that at the first meeting we won't touch on these areas, but now we have some more background by which to work from, not only during this phase, but once we get into our October meeting. So unless there are any other questions, I'd like to thank everyone that took the time to participate today. And again, this has been recorded, so it'll be made available for folks. And I'm looking forward to either talking with you or seeing you soon. Greetings from up here in lovely Hope, Maine. I've been meeting with the Maine Fire Chief, so it's been a great day, but it's a little gray outside. So I'll be heading back to New Hampshire and hopefully some sunshine. So without further ado, thanks everyone.
Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.